Hey everyone, welcome to our class Writing for Young Readers here on WordCamp. This is the first time we've ever taught this brand new class, and we have a guest for today. My name's Connor. I'm the host of most boot camps and a lot of workshops and events over on Script Camp. And here on WordCamp, which is our novel writing focused server, here we have boot camps that will take you all the way from idea to finished draft of a brand new feature script, TV pilot script, or novel script and manuscript. Here's the dates for the boot camps that we have now. So TV pilot starts September 15th and is running Fridays 6 to 8. This novel session just started 2 weeks ago, so we're halfway through outlining now, but we're going to be starting the writing portion of that Saturdays 12 to 2 on WordCamp starting September 30th. And then we have feature boot camp that just started today, just the last class. That's running Sundays 10 to noon for the next 8 weeks. So it's not too late to join if you want to write a brand new feature, novel, or TV episode. Thank you for joining us, folks. Here's the table read slots. So 2 p.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Pacific, or 2 a.m. Pacific being the international time slot. 3 times a week, you can join a table read or have your own script read here on our servers to get feedback from the rest of the community. So, we are doing writing for young readers today, so we're talking children's fiction, which actually includes young adult, middle grade chapter, and picture books. So here's just the overview. We'll start with introing our guest. We'll move into different designations of like target market for children's fiction. We can look at some of the best and most popular best-selling children's books and maybe discuss why we think they hit so well or what was it about them that really caught on with readers. We can look at children's subject matter and themes and how to approach different types of subject matter and themes with different audiences in mind. From there, we can move to more technical stuff like prose, kinds of words and complexity of language to be choosing when writing for readers of different age categories. Rebekah will be able to tell us more about publishing in children's, which I have not done before, and a little more about this kind of emerging teen market, which is something that I don't have as much background in. And then we have a couple games and exercises, which I think will be fun. We're going to be doing kidification and sort of taking adult stories and reimagining them as children's books. I had some fun with that, just prepping for the class. All right, so let's start with an intro. Becky, why don't you tell us who you are, what you write, and anything else you want to share?
Hi, so I'm Becky. I'm from the UK, in case you can't tell. And I write this new teen category that I'll be sort of covering. But for most people, I say I write upper middle grade. And I haven't been published yet, but I have a first look deal with Chicken House, which was set up by the guy who published Harry Potter. And so I'm currently working with an editor who's works for the company, and I'm working with a mentor who runs a group that's about supporting people to become get into the children's market, and as such, she gives me information. I'm very inquisitive. I ask lots of information, so I've just assimilated everything that she's told me. So although I'm not published yet, I have gathered some insights into publishing and where it is at the moment.
Great. And as for myself, I'm not published yet either. Neither one of us are published yet, but I am a professional screenwriter who's been repped as a screenwriter since 2017. I have had a few scripts set up in town before the strike. Wrote an episode of Creepshow back in 2019 and have placed in Nicholl Fellowship semifinals, Launchpad top 10. I'm mostly coming from this world of screenwriting and playwriting, but I have moved into more into novel writing in the past couple years, especially as breaking into screenwriting has gotten harder and harder, and they're making less and less movies every year, and they're being stratified so much between ultra low budget and ultra high budget that I thought publishing and writing novels as one of my first things I really loved to read as a kid would be a great way to continue to build a career as a writer and to cross-pollinate between screenwriting and prose and playwriting and all these things that can be adapted and readapted in various forms. So I have written, I'm finishing my 5th novel now and moving into querying this upcoming week. So hopefully very soon we'll be getting that lit agent and getting that big book deal, etc. But until then, I just have the couple years I've been teaching these novel boot camps under my belt at this point, and also a lot of knowledge about screenwriting and the Hollywood market.
I just want to add to that I am also at the moment querying to get an agent because I've got this first look deal, but I don't have an agent. So my editor has been helping me now to get an agency. Yes, I am with you in that querying trenches.
Right, great. So we are in a stage channel, so you can feel free to leave your questions in the chat. So mouse over the classroom channel if you're following us on Discord and click that white word bubble, and you can leave questions or comments from me or Becky as we move forward. You can tag one or the other of us in it if you really want to. If you're watching on one of our other platforms like YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, or Facebook, you should come join us on Discord, which you can find the link to by going to scriptcamp.net. You can just click up here in the top right where it says login, and you'll be directed right to ScriptCamp, and from there you can join us here on WordCamp too. We have over 100 hours of live classes and events and workshops every month between our different servers, so we hope to see you guys signing up and hope to see you soon. So let's go into children's fiction. Most people, when they hear children's books, they think picture books. And they aren't wrong, but that's not the only thing that this is. And it's actually a pretty broad designation that includes everything up to upper YA, which is meant for like 18-year-olds, and all the way down to Very Hungry Caterpillar level of, simplistic rhyming picture books, Dr. Seuss, and stuff like that. So I thought we could actually define the different types of children's fiction and maybe just break down the specific differences. So in young adult, I guess in all of these we're mostly looking at, for some reason publishing is very fixated on the age of the audience, the expectation being that the audience usually wants to read the books that are about people that are their age or a couple years older. So we saw a lot of 14 and 15-year-olds reading Hunger Games and Twilight and things like this, even though these are about older teenagers and they're 17, 18, because I think kids are curious as to the stuff that's coming next. If you're in middle school, you have all these thoughts and interests related to high school. If you're in elementary school, you're curious about middle school as that next big step. So everyone's kind of looking ahead a little bit to the next kind of phase of their lives and all the exciting stuff that come with that next phase. So we have the age of the protagonist as a key factor in determining who the book is sort of for, which is not to say that no adult books can feature younger protagonists, but it's a requirement in the publishing world that young adult middle grade fiction focus on children characters. So in YA, the protagonist is a teenager, and the book is written from the point of view, not necessarily first person, but at least from the third person POV of that teenager, not in retrospect with them as an adult. So they're a teenager that is still a teenager as they're narrating the book. Middle grade would be ages about 9 to 13, which leaves YA maybe usually people consider 14 and up to 18 to be the kind of classic YA teenager kind of range. We have chapter books, which would maybe be ages 5 to 8-ish. There's not really a real hard cutoff on that. And then picture books is usually kind of going to be like infancy up to 8-ish years. Maybe not 8. Maybe that's a little late. Maybe like 6 or 7 years old. What do you think, Becky? Do these numbers sound right to you?
Yeah, the only thing I say is that there is a crossover with some older picture books that cross over with chapter books. So most picture books are more infant, discovering the world, but there is a crossover with children who aren't as confident with reading. So there's a lot of books that are written where some children are confident and go straight to chapter books, whereas there are others that, so you can get away with writing a picture book for an older kid if so, but it is a very big difference. There's like picture books for non-school age children and then picture books for school age children who just haven't grasped reading yet.
Right. These would sort of be almost more like illustrated chapter books that have like a picture every few pages. I kind of wish more adult books had illustrations the way that those books did. You just don't see illustrated adult books very often. The art is obviously a huge aspect in a lot of this type of writing, like picture or chapter. If you have illustrations, if you have pictures in the first place, I think you need to even include them I think a lot of time when you're querying, you include sample art or links to illustrations. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So, picture books. It's the art that tells the story, because a lot of the children can't read. But the words are to try and help them to read. The whole point is try and help them to read. You normally would expect a parent or a teacher to be reading with the child, and the child can get the concept based on the art. And usually with picture books, I don't write picture books, but one of my friends is published as a picture book author. And usually what happens is she has an artist that she works with, really close with, all the time. When she first went in, she just sent words in with no illustrations. And just sent the words in to prove her worth. But now she works with this same artist, and she comes up with the story, she comes up with the words, but then the artist will talk to her about, oh, how will we do this? And then she'll change the words to kind of match the art, and it's a really close relationship. Whereas when you go older, even in chapter books, you have illustrators, but they don't normally work as closely with you. And when you start getting into middle grade and YA, some publishers might show you a cover and let you pick. Some won't, so you have even less of a relationship with the illustrator. So
Right. So in some ways, it's a little bit more like breaking into comics, where it's helpful if you have that relationship with an illustrator already. And when you're querying and sending out materials to have art samples that are ready to go, you're not just sending in text. You have like a little more to show in your portfolio. We haven't even touched on graphic novels, which I don't actually know much about at all, but are growing. They're definitely growing in children's.
They're growing, yeah, they're hugely growing. I will say with picture books, there's a lot more leniency than with comics. Publishers tend to have their own illustrators in-house, and they want to see how well you can write your words, and now put you with the publisher, with the illustrator, and see how well they work with drawing your pictures. That's like the first stage. Once you are then connected with them, publisher wants you to work with them because it's a really close relationship, and that's when you start collaborating with them. But when you're first querying, it's just better not to it's very rare that a publisher or picture books would take on a writer and an artist. If you are an artist who's also a picture book writer, that's fine, they'll take you on. But if you're a picture book writer and your friend's an artist, be prepared that the publisher will turn one of you down. They might say, oh, I really like this person's art, I'm going to take them on. Or I really like your writing style, we'll assign you an artist. They rarely take on teams.
Oh, good to know. I did not know that. I thought it would be to your advantage to have a team, but if there's a chance that it would work against you, go ahead.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that it'll work against you. It's just to be prepared that they might say, well, actually, no, we only want you as a writer and not your friend who's the artist.
Right. Okay, good to know. So, why don't you tell us about this new emerging category?
So this is a category which and this is globally, some publishers have taken on and other publishers haven't. So I really emphasize, only use this term to define your work if your work falls into this category, if the agent or the publisher do on their website. It's emerging, it isn't set yet, but it's called teen, and it came from this idea that middle grade, you tend to think are thinner books, a lot of children who are tween, that kind of 10 to 14-year-old, are look at those books or 10 to 13 even, and think they're too babyish. A lot of them aren't, but there's such a wide range. The problem is that then you go to the YA category that can go, as Conor said, right up to adult, and can have themes of sex, drugs, things that aren't appropriate for a 10, 11, 12-year-old, or that their parents won't want them reading. So parents were getting frustrated that there wasn't anything. They didn't want their children going to the YA section, but the children didn't want to go to the middle grade section. Publishers spotted this, and some bookshops, and I've seen pictures of this in America and in the UK, have a category now. They're called moving on from middle grade, or upper middle grade, or they call it clean YA, and there's all these different terms for it. It's all basically the same thing. It's that upper middle grade / lower YA. And the idea of it is that you have the same complex themes and characters as YA. It's still them looking at the wider world, learning about what's what's going wrong in the world and all of that. But it has the sensibilities of middle grade, including, very important, happy endings, no sex. But the worst you could, or the most you could do if you're doing romance, is kiss on the cheek, a hug. Nothing that would be considered, if it's not suitable for middle grade, it's not suitable for teen. But the themes are more grown up, and it's, say, it is this kind of, some publishers have taken it and run with it and absolutely love it. Other publishers are steering away. So I emphasize, at the moment, only use it if they use it. But if you feel that yours falls into this, where your ideal reader is 10 to 14, rather than, you say, oh, I'm writing for upper middle grade or lower YA, you're writing for teen, and it's a category to be aware of. It might change its name, but it's definitely one that a lot of publishers are pushing. So it is believed that it is going to be here to stay, but there's no guarantee on that.
Right, like new adult, it might kind of just be subsumed by the other genres. Like new adult was kind of eaten by YA.
Exactly. Yeah.
Some people still insist it's out there, and and some people occasionally do use the term still, but a lot of people have given up on new adult at this point.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's exactly like that. It might become a thing. I mean, middle grade wasn't really a thing in the way that we know it until Harry Potter.
Exactly.
So yeah, so it might.
And sometimes it's even weird to look back at older books that you're like, wait, is this YA or is this not? Like Ender's Game.
Exactly.
Is that a middle grade
exactly.
book? I don't think so.
Yeah. Nowadays,
the category didn't really exist then, right?
Exactly. And nowadays it would be classed as teen.
Yeah, so, I guess it would. They're pretty dark. Like the later ones would maybe even be.
Oh, the later ones go into YA.
Yeah, they definitely.
Got a lot to say. Get there. I've got a lot to say about Harry Potter and how it grew.
Right, exactly. Sometimes a series can change designation over time, which I think feels very obvious to us now, but until Harry Potter really made this like extremely popular, that wasn't as well known of an idea. Like the readership ages up with the progression of the series, which was like a brilliant concept to capitalize on.
Yeah.
And now we see that, we're like, yeah, of course you would do that. Why wouldn't anyone do that? But that was like rare to see before Harry Potter popularized that.
Yeah.
So we have to look at your age category in terms of the complexity of language and ideas, subject matter, and the kinds of topics that you're going to be covering and including in the book, and then also just the stuff that your readership is interested in. Because you have to ask, why do a lot of YA books have a love triangle in them? Why do a lot of middle grade books involve characters going to school or getting in conflicts with like teachers and trying to pass tests and stuff like that? Why do adult books involve cheating and divorce more than kids' books do, right? You can explore any subject matter through the lens of any audience, or like for any audience. There are YA books about the Holocaust, and there are adult books about people going on first dates. And you should just take into account the kind of interests that your target audience has and skew the presentation of your story accordingly. Like Becky, for instance, if you were to write a book with divorce as one of its central conflicts, how would you make that a kid's book?
So there are a lot of really good books where divorce is a major conflict, but it's usually the children's parents are getting a divorce, and it's from the perspective of the child dealing with the fact their parents are getting a divorce and all the feelings that come with that, like child guilt and things like that, rather than from the perspective of parents actually doing it.
Right, exactly. So you have to imagine what are the kinds of conflicts that this subject matter would create that a kid would then have to deal with. So the focus of like a middle grade book that's centered on divorce would be like, now I have 2 houses that I have to go back and forth between every weekend, and that's hard and difficult for a kid. That is a substantial challenge that we can't really like look down on or talk down to the audience that we're writing for. If you write a book where the tone is sort of like almost making fun of the kid for being upset about this, or like treating it as ridiculous that they're upset about this, or like not taking their perspective and treating the conflicts that they encounter seriously, which is not to say you can't have fun with it. It can still be a fun story no matter what it's about, pretty much, no matter what it's about. There are some exceptions, maybe. But
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, but even then, there is a book. Oh, I wish I could remember what it was called. You were saying about Holocaust book for YA. There was a book for middle grade, and it's about a character called Death in it.
The Book Thief.
The Book Thief. The Book Thief. Yeah, and it's set during the Holocaust.
Yeah.
But it's still quite, although it's covering a really dark subject, it's still got this mystical bit about it, because it's got this character Death who's really busy at this time of year, this time in history, and there's still this almost adventure feel about it. You know, it's still aimed at children.
Yeah.
Children don't want to be depressed.
There's an element of whimsy to that book which is hard to express. Like, you wouldn't believe me that there's a sort of whimsy to it, but there is. And the main character also in that one is not or the narrator, I should say, is not a kid. But the character that the girl that we focus on is like 14, right? So that's a YA story, essentially. That's kind of like probably the darkest a book in this category can possibly get. I mean, it's about maybe the absolute darkest things you can. I mean, it kind of goes to show that there's not really limits. I mean, could you do a children's book that centers on something like sexual assault? Probably. There's probably a way to do that. I'm sure that has existed and been out there, right? So where do we draw the line, Becky?
I have seen, and there are a certain category of picture books that are not given to every kid.
Right.
They are written for specific children going through specific things. So there are picture books out there about a child who's gone through sexual abuse. It is for the child who has gone through that. It's not, you can't go to Amazon and buy it. You know, it's more of a therapy, but it's still written like a picture book.
Right. Those are sort of, I wouldn't consider those mass market, but those are sort of more in a therapeutic setting. Or they would be probably not written by traditional children's book authors, or they might be written in conjunction with them, but maybe written more like by people with backgrounds in therapy or child psychology.
Yeah. The friend who does the picture books, she did exactly that. She worked with a therapist to write them.
Right. A very good idea. A therapist, by the way, is just an excellent consultant no matter what you're writing. I think that after having watched enough YouTube videos about talking to therapists and watching them break down movies and shows, I was like, every TV staff should have a therapist on the staff.
Yeah.
They're experts in why people do what they do.
Can I say something about the not talking down to children?
Mm-hmm.
So a really good tip, a good exercise to do is you when you do this, you need to be aware that children today are different from when you were a child. They have technology and stuff. There are some fundamental things that are always true. And try and remember the day you started secondary school or high school. Try to put yourself back into that. Try to remember the time you were lying in bed listening to your parents argue, or the first death you remember experiencing in the family, and really dig in deep to how that made you as a child feel, not you as an adult now looking back. Because as an adult looking back, you go, sure, first day of school was fine. But as a child, you're walking into this place where everyone's bigger than you, and you went from a school where you were the biggest to now being the smallest, and tap into those emotions of that time. Children now have phones, mobile phones, they have social media, which we didn't have, but bullying was always a thing, and it still is. It's just taken a different form. You can still tap into how you felt then.
Exactly. And to sort of, you see this sometimes, especially with adults now, that are like, the kids are on the wrong path. You know, they're like, they're addicted to these phones all the time. It's social media. Whereas if you write that as sort of the theme or message of a kid's book, it might result in the kids being like, "Who's this boomer like telling me to get off my phone at the dinner table?" Like, they grew up with that phone. You didn't. You may not have grown up with a cell phone. I didn't have a cell phone until I was in 7th grade, I think.
Exactly.
But they don't remember a time where they didn't have a phone.
Every generation has that things where they were addicted to it and the older generation hated it. So just try and find your thing. For me, it was Pokemon cards. I remember adults getting really annoyed that we had Pokemon cards, and all we did was sit in front of the TV all the time, because TVs were, I'm 40, so TVs were, as a normal thing in every house, was relatively normal, relatively new, sorry, at the time. So you can kind of, if you want to try and see how kids feel now about boomers, think about when you were a kid and what it was that adults were moaning at you about, because every generation is different in what they do. But my mum's generation, it was the rock and roll.
Mm-hmm.
And her mum and dad were having a go at her for listening to rock and roll music. Why don't you listen to normal music? So you can actually up into that and really understand how kids feel today.
Right. And just the adult style moralizing doesn't really work with kids, especially if you're criticizing a fundamental way that they live and are. Like,
yes, yeah, exactly.
if you're like if you're like mad at the kids for being on their phones all the time, your anger is misplaced, and it needs to be mad at, for instance, I don't know, the people making the phones or the social media, like making the sites or whatever it is. And if you try to sell the kid on a story where they're like, you shouldn't be doing this thing you've been doing your whole life as much, or you're wrong for wanting to be like your friends are, or something like that, then they could reject the lesson and therefore reject the story.
Yeah.
So how important is it to, before we move on to this, I want to touch on this idea of lessons and moralizing. How important do you think it is to have a kind of, quote, lesson to your story? Do you need one?
No. I mean, you need to be aware of the audience that you are writing for. If you're going to write a picture book, I mean, this is the same also for TV, by the way. If you're writing a script for a children's TV show, you can't have a 7-year-old opening the oven by themselves, because other 7-year-olds would go, "Oh, I can do that," and you don't want them to be doing that. So you have to be aware of the audience you're writing for and not having them just do things that you wouldn't want the children to mimic, because children do mimic. But I would say, first and foremost, it needs to be entertaining. You are there to entertain a child, not to teach them.
Right.
You always can have messages. Every story has a message, whoever it's written for. It doesn't matter who it's written for. Adult stories have a character growth where the character has a want and need, and by the end of the story, they maybe get what they want, or they don't, but they learn what they need. And often they can live without what they want, or they give something up. It's exactly the same in children's books, and it's exactly the same in adult books. So that kind of message is, if you're writing because you want to preach a message to kids, then they're not going to read your book. If you're writing a book because you want to entertain children, and during the course of that book they learn something, then great. Harry Potter is a great example. It's basically the story of good and evil. It's basically the story of, good overcoming evil. It's got moral messages in there, but kids prefer to just read it because it's magical and wonderful.
Yeah, and maybe at a certain level of complexity, different people might take sort of different things from the story. You don't have to sum everything up in one little lesson necessarily. It can work for picture books, for instance, if your story is like, this is about the wolf that learned to share, then you're going to have a pretty clear, final arc for that character, where it's like, okay, at the beginning the wolf doesn't like sharing, but then through the course of this she learns that it's important to, so by the end she does share. And in that one, the dramatic argument's pretty simple. It's sharing is good, right? So you can do that, especially for younger, but you don't need to wrap, I don't think you need to wrap everything up in as simple of a presentation. Like, go ahead.
This is the ideal time, actually, to share that picture book I wanted to share with you. I'm going to put the link in the chat because it's a really old children's book, but there's actually a lesson in it for the adults reading it, not for the children. So I've done the link and I'll read it. It's story time. So this is a picture book. It was written a long time ago.
Great.
You might have heard of it.
I've not heard of this. This
now.
Cool.
Oh, it's so good. It's called Not Now, Bernard. So if you, it's literally a book. So, hello, Dad, said Bernard. Not now, Bernard, said his father.
Smashing his hand with the hammer there.
Yeah. Hello, Mum, said Bernard. Not now, Bernard, said his mother. He's busy washing up. There's a monster in the garden and it's going to eat me, said Bernard. Not now, Bernard, said his mother.
Looks like she spilled or broken the vase there.
Oh, yes.
So he keeps distracting them. They keep messing up the task that they're in, so he's annoying them.
So Bernard went into the garden. Hello, monster, he said to the monster. And this is the bit. The monster ate Bernard up, every bit. And the monster went indoors.
Wow. I did not see that coming.
I know, right? A picture book where the child dies. Yeah. Whoa, went the monster behind Bernard's mother. Not now, Bernard, said Bernard's mother.
Well, getting paint on the floor there.
The mother bit Bernard's father. Not now, Bernard, said Bernard's father. Your dinner's ready, said Bernard's mother. She put the dinner in front of the television. The monster ate the dinner and it watched the television. Top of it.
Yeah.
Then it read one of Bernard's comics and broke one of his toys. Go to bed, I've taken up your milk, called Bernard's mother. The monster went upstairs. I'm a monster, said the monster. Not now, Bernard, said Bernard's mother.
That picture on the left is so good. That would be a good background for a phone or something.
Yeah.
Is that the end?
And that's literally it.
That's it. All right, how many pages was that? Let's see. That was like probably 20. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 26 pages.
26, yeah.
Including covers, so maybe more like 24.
Yes, yeah. And what I really like about it is two things I like about that. Firstly, they always say in a children's book you can't have the child protagonist die. Well,
clearly not.
But also that this is a lesson for the parents, not the child, because the lesson here is don't ignore your child. You know, they'll
misbehave. They'll turn into a little monster.
Yeah. So
I like this. It's great. It works on a few levels, and I like it because I think that is a good example to bring up as for how a story can have subject matter that's entertaining for the kid, but a theme that is resonant for the adult reading it.
Yes. And this is a book that a child won't be reading, an adult will be reading to their child. And so the child's giggling because, oh, the monster ate Bernard, because, you know, children. But the adult will be, oh, I've done that to my kid. So, yeah, it was just an interesting example.
Also, I think the repetition works well in picture books that are meant to be read aloud because, as you did here, we can tell you have some experience narrating books out loud, especially to kids, perhaps, because every time you read the repetitive phrase, you can do the intonation a little bit differently, or you can have the kid yell it out with you and have the kid participate in the book because they be the one to say, "Not now, Bernard," on the next page, right?
Yes, because they know what's coming. Even if they don't that's how they start recognizing the words,
right?
By that repetition, and they know it's coming, and they sort of do it with you. And yeah, it's I wish I could write picture books. They seem really easy because there was very few words. They're the hardest thing in the world to write.
Yeah, they are. A lot of people are like, well, writing a full adult novel sounds hard. I'll just write a kid's book because kids don't care what happens in the book. They don't mind. As long as it's got a funny face on it, then they'll buy it. And that's not the case. It's very difficult to get reps or to sell a children's book. It's easy to write a bad one.
Omni's just said, I'm 99.9% sure I remember that book from school as a tiny kid. And that's why, The Very Hungry Caterpillar is such a famous book. I mean, that was our childhood, and kids still read it now. There are certain books that are timeless because that thought was...
Sorry to cut you off.
There we go.
But nice transition to our topic here, though. We have Hungry Caterpillar right there.
Yep.
So I thought maybe we could look at what are those timeless books that have stood the test and that have been the highest selling in their particular subcategory. So I have here, I'm not 100% on this, but I did a couple Google searches, and this is essentially what I was able to deduce. I think I was seeing conflicting responses if Peter Rabbit or if Hungry Caterpillar was the top selling picture book. And I think there's multiple Peter Rabbit books, so maybe as a franchise it outsells Hungry Caterpillar or something like that. But Hungry Caterpillar is by Eric Kripke, is I think, just in terms of a singular book that's not a franchise, the highest selling standalone picture book. And then we have middle grade, we have Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, which is the highest selling book of all time,
and
like the Bible, right?
And the Philosopher's Stone.
Thank you. Yes, exactly.
Sorry, did you notice I added the K?
Yes.
Sorry.
It's good. In America, I think we don't have that same grounding in Philosopher's Stone being a folkloric element that everyone's familiar with. So I see why they changed it in this case. Yeah. Golden Compass makes a little less sense, but that's okay. Go ahead.
That does actually bring me on to something. Be prepared for the fact that your book will be translated and you will have no say in it. Right. As a UK author, it'll be translated to American and they won't consult you. As an American author, it'll be translated to UK and they won't consult you. Just be prepared for that.
Depending on how you set up the publishing rights, like you want to get world English is like the goal. So that would be English in all markets, so US, UK, Australia, and there's lots of other countries that have English publishing too. So like world English is important to get those rights for sure.
Yeah.
And then, go ahead.
I say, but they still will because children's markets. This is where with an adult book, you get the English copy and you're like, oh, I know that it's got. This is one example. I'm going to put it in the chat. So Americans use hello, he said, a double thing. British have both, right? And it's actually really common. I was meant to put a comma before he said, but British authors, a lot of them only have singular.
Oh yeah, and you mean the quote? So because
the quotation marks
on the screen behind me, that's quotation mark versus just essentially apostrophes to denote dialogue tags.
Yeah, so that's just one little thing, but because you're writing a children's book, now a lot of English people now use the double because we've been speech marks. Yeah, a lot of people now use the double because we've been influenced by America, but because we are working with children who are learning to read and write, the book will be adapted to American or to English, or UK English, because we don't want to be teaching American English to our kids, and Americans don't want to be learning British English. They're learning to spell. Right. You guys don't want your kids spelling colour with a U. We don't want our kids spelling colour without.
Yeah. So. That's what Peppa Pig is for. That's what how the Americans get there. All the American kids start speaking in British accents nowadays. So let's look at the top selling books. So we have Peter Rabbit, which I vaguely remember from when I was a kid, and Hungry Caterpillar, which I know quite well. We have Sorcerer's Stone / Philosopher's Stone, and then in YA, I was getting a little bit of mixed results, whether it's Hunger Games or Twilight, but I think it ultimately is Hunger Games at this point.
I'm pretty sure why it's Hunger Games.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm not sure if that's whole franchise sales or if that's just the singular book, but I'm pretty sure it's just the singular book. So, what can we learn from this, Becky? What do you think? How can we assess why these have been the most successful in their categories?
So, I mean, I personally would say they brought something new. If you're writing, don't mimic Harry Potter, as Harry Potter's been done.
Mm-hmm.
But Harry Potter was the time when publishers were saying children don't read anymore, there's no point in middle grade, and the boarding school story is dead.
Mm-hmm.
And J.K. Rowling came, and she was turned down by 23 publishers, and that was even after she got an agent. And it was one guy, the guy who might be publishing my book, just putting it out there, who spotted it and said, I want to give it a chance. Because it was new at the time. Last boarding school stories had been things like, there were a couple, but there were mainly things like Enid Blyton, so that's kind of really early and very quintessentially British, and so that was something new. Peter Rabbit was in the Victorian era, and it was a woman writer for one thing, which was rare, and also again was written at a time when children's books weren't really a thing, as in they were a thing, but like parents now say, phones are bad for children's health, they say books were bad for children's health.
Mm-hmm.
And then Hunger Games dealt with children dying, did it in a very non-graphical way. It wasn't. People say it's a rip-off of that film Battle Royale, but Battle Royale is aimed at adults, whereas Hunger Games is aimed at teenagers, so it's like not done in a very graphic way, so it was safe to read, and I think they all just pushed the boundaries.
Also, I think when it came, let's remind ourselves the year that Hunger Games came out. Can somebody search that for me, or maybe I'll just do a quick search?
Yeah, I can look it up.
2008. Okay.
Yeah.
I think also the rise of this book and coinciding with the rise of just sort of dystopian teen fiction in the first place was partially a result of social media becoming super popular, so we can see things like revolutions happening all around the world. Protests in the U.S., the protest movement, or like different protest movements, like everything from Occupy Wall Street to protests based on police shootings and things like that, were really starting to increase from like the 2008 to 2015 type era. And I think we started to get the idea, or the teens of the world started to get this idea, hey, we can really make a difference and shake things up and change things.
Yes. And that also goes with Harry Potter as well, in that although it was her trying this new thing of going back to boarding school, there was also, I was pretty much an adult, but I remember it was kind of, it wasn't really social media was a thing, but the internet was a thing, so children were starting to, see, like, things like you say, we were starting to see things really early on. It was 25 years ago now, maybe a bit more than that now, I think. And I think also it was a time when children were starting to want that kind of independence, really. Just, and people, like I say, people thought children weren't reading anymore, and turned out they did. It came at a time when a lot of books, in the UK at least, I don't know about the US, in the UK at least, a lot of children's books were preaching at children, and children didn't want to be preached at.
Right. And yeah, the characters in Harry Potter are, of course, very self-reliant. We can't rely on the adults to fix all the problems for us. And also, I think this was a time when, this was like advent of the internet type of era, right? So some of the first fandom sites were definitely Harry Potter related, and it has such a strong element of this could happen to you, and if it did, which house would you be in? That sort of stuff.
Yeah.
That kind of really activates a kid's imagination in a way that few other things can, which is asking, how would you be categorized?
And this is a really important element when you're trying to sell your book to a publisher, just like in the film industry. So writing for children and young adults, very similar to writing to the film industry, both in structure of the story and the length, but also in the way that you market it. And one of the big things is the publisher wants to know, is this going to be marketable beyond just the book? Because the book doesn't make you much money, doesn't make the publisher much money. But what does make them money is film rights and marketing franchises, and can we make dolls out of this? Can we make, not propaganda, and things as simple as, basically, but things as simple as what house are you in? Or with the Hunger Games, the slogan of "May the odds ever be in your favor."
Right,
just simple, real key things like that.
I think there's a wish fulfillment in both of them that doesn't leap out necessarily Hunger Games as having wish fulfillment, but it actually does, because although it's a horrible world, it's dystopian, there's death games being held that children are forced to murder each other, but she becomes the face of this movement, and the main character becomes the face of this revolution. And she is treated like a celebrity while she is becoming like this. She's being inducted into their the tribute society or whatever it's called, where she's being dressed up, she's being interviewed. Like she gets a stylist. You get to kind of experience What If I Won American Idol a little bit, and then go ahead.
And also teens. Again, if you go back to when you were a teen. If you're either one or two, like I always say, it's like one or two things. You're either a rebel, or you were one of those that wanted to go and do all the marches and all of that. Like when I was a teen, I remember I wanted to change the world, and teenagers now are doing the same thing. So yeah, there is that wish fulfillment of, this is one person who's changing everything. I could do that, and that's why so many teens follow Greta Thunberg. She is literally doing what they wish they could do.
She's just a young adult hero in real life.
Yeah, exactly. And then there is there is a strong sense with teens that is there, like that's what that's kind of they're getting their identity. And I talk a bit later about like what the different stages are, but that is their big thing. Is they want to rage against the machine, and again, it has happened every generation. There's literally a song called it.
That's that I would say is an important part of this too, is if you're writing this too, like you have to know that you are writing to an audience that sort of fantasizes about perhaps not just changing the world, but they have a lot of wishes and things they could fulfill. But in terms of changing the world, not only do they think about that or want to read stories about that, but that's also possible. Like teenagers can and do actually change the world and are the people that, for instance, fight wars. We kind of forget that wars are fought by teenagers. All the kids do these big important things, and we can lean into that and use that and sort of use the books to celebrate that rather than condescending and saying like, well, that's fantasy though. You're not really going to do that.
One of the most important things when you're writing a children's book at any age is that it needs to be the child that wins. Sometimes I've had feedback from adults who don't read children's books, who will say to me things like, so one of my books is Murder Mystery on a Starship, and they'll say, it's really unlikely that a 12-year-old will solve a murder that loads of adults haven't been able to solve. And I'm like, yeah, but it wouldn't be a children's book if the adult solved it. It's got to be the child who solved it. And by having a different outlook to the adults, because they're a child, like it's their unique outlook on life. So in my one that I've got the first look deal, it's a teenager who gets herself sent to an adult prison. Now the reason why she manages to get around is that everyone underestimates what a 14-year-old can do.
Right.
Everyone's like, oh, she won't be a danger, she won't be any trouble, and she is, because she's 14. But by constantly underestimating her, and it's that kind of thing where some of the best stories actually are adults underestimating the kids.
Right. And this kind of stuff works really well. I would say that having your child characters beat the adults and win is sort of an expectation for the genre, for the same reason that, like Encyclopedia Brown, is it likely that a kid would be able to solve these mysteries that his police chief father wouldn't be able to solve? Who cares? It's not really about it being realistic exactly. I would say, just to try to avoid this thing where, like, your kid is just better at everything, or better than everyone at everything, if they just run circles around every other character and they don't really feel like they are outmatched, it can kind of lose a little bit of engagement from the readers, rather than, like, take the deck is stacked against them and they're fighting an uphill climb because of their age, for sure. But that doesn't mean they can't ultimately triumph and win and be rewarded. And we really, like, kids typically don't like huge downer endings.
That's one difference between, that's what I'm saying, with the teen category, because some YA books, as you get older, actually can have downer endings. Middle grade, there's very few exceptions, and even those, there's big debates about whether they're even middle grade, like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. It's sold as a middle grade, but actually the writer didn't intend it to be middle grade, and there's a big debate about whether it even is. So middle grade, it tends to be happy endings, and that's the case with teen. Is that you need an upbeat ending.
And even in YA, if you do have a downer ending, publishers still prefer if there's, like, some kind of note of hope or optimism at all.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So you can try to find a way to make that work in your story. Like, just remember that you want them to read it again. Like, kids read books a bunch of times, usually. Or, like, they choose the same book to be read to them multiple times because they love it and want to hear that story again. And if it makes them miserable at the end of it, are chances good they're going to want to... Like, has any kid ever reread Where the Red Fern Grows, ever?
Exactly. And I would also argue that as a writer, as an adult writer, it's our responsibility to give youth that hope, because, children have always had mental health, children and teenagers, but it's more prevalent now than ever before. You've got teenagers that are on social media that get news 24/7. You think during the Second World War, people got news twice a day. So that's how they cope with it. Now, European children are seeing war in Europe and literally get the news whenever they want. They are seeing the climate change and are seeing it all as it happens. And that's a lot on children. And the world can be a crushing, depressing place for them now. So I would also argue that it's our job as a writer for children to show them that there is good as well.
That's a great point. I hadn't even thought of that. But yeah, you have to think of, what is your reader hearing on the news every day? Like, in other stories like yours, what are they being bombarded with? Like, what is out there in terms of other media that they're watching or taking in? What are the messages that they're being exposed to again and again? And they're going through a lot, so maybe, like, try not to ruin their day. I guess the big exception is dog books, right? Like, dog books are always just brutal.
Oh yeah.
Because, and except for Shiloh, if you remember, Shiloh lives at the end of that book, and I think there's a couple in that series. So that was my favorite as a kid. I liked Shiloh, the beagle. But most of the time, the dog dying is kind of built into the structure of dog stories. So you can see why these are less popular than they used to be when we have a million more options.
Please note, very few have been published in the last 10 years.
Yeah, you're competing
compared
with...
to in the past.
You're competing with Old Yeller, Red Fern, and the big stuff like that, and it's like, those are just gonna tear your kid to pieces. So they're not as popular now. Anyway, shall we move on to... So we've been, I guess, on this subject matter and themes. And we've talked about stories that different age groups gravitate to. I mean, like, school stories are always going to work because every kid goes to school in some way. Maybe you could have a homeschool story that would be interesting in its own way too, or something like that.
And can I add to that although, so you'll hear publishers say things like, school stories are dead. What they actually mean is they need it told in a different way. So they don't want magical boarding schools, but maybe make it that there's a British book that came out called Scandal and the Unicorn Thief, and the author was the biggest amount paid to a debut author in the world. She got over 1 million.
Wow.
And it's huge in the UK, and it is a boarding school story, but A, it's not advertised as such, and B, it's basically this island is the boarding school. And and equally, you can do a story set in the school holidays, but it's still the school holidays, so it's still kind of around school, or some other institution. So yeah, it's you'll hear publishers say certain things, but I've learned you have to interpret that.
Sure, exactly. Because it's tough to avoid school in your story if you're focusing on a child character, unless it takes place in a fantasy world or something like that, where there is no basic institutions that we have here. These are the kinds of things that are just like the law in most Western society. Your kid has to go to school, so every kid will go through that and can relate to the basics of that. They can understand. You go to classes to learn different topics, and you will have to pass tests to prove that you learned enough. Along the way, you'll make friends and you'll meet different teachers. Some you like, some you don't like, some are mean, some are nice. And all that stuff is just like easily relatable to by kids in almost any culture. So let's ask, you're just talking about how you were saying publishers are considering school stories to be dead right now, at least. What other subject matter is sort of worn out? Like, what else are kids, do you think, maybe tired of reading about? Or what are things that are oversaturated in the market?
So at the moment, my mentor just went to Frankfurt, which is like the really big toy thing, and spoke to the really big book thing, and spoke to agents and publishers. And at the moment, they're saying that they are looking for more lower YA, that teen. They're saying that middle grade magic and fantasy is currently oversaturated, and that's as a result of COVID and books debut authors being postponed, and there was a build up, and also of changing tastes. So at the moment they are looking for funny books, especially for younger middle grade. They're looking for contemporary books with an uplifting feel, and they are looking for school books, but in YA rather than in children's, in middle grade, sorry. And they're not as much looking for middle grade, but that doesn't mean that if you're writing middle grade fantasy, you should be thinking, oh no, what am I going to do? Because the market changes so fast. So the general advice is don't write for the market, write the story you want to tell, because it will come back round. I mean, a couple of years ago, the dystopian future YA was considered dead. It's starting to come back again. Agents are starting to ask for it again. After Harry Potter, the boarding school was considered dead when we got an oversaturation of other boarding school. Again, I've got a book right now that I'm reading called Crooks Haven, which is about thieves and crooks that go to like lawbreakers that go to a boarding school to learn how to break the law, like to help people. It's like, but it's topics always make a comeback. At the moment, I hate to say this because it is one of my stories, but superheroes are getting fatigued. So unless you have something really unique with superheroes, we're starting to get fatigued. Kids aren't as interested in like real life gritty at the moment. We talked about the fact that what they're going on, they're not really interested in that. And while there has been a boom in YA romance, I think that is getting to the point where it's oversaturated and people aren't looking as much for the romance at the moment. Although that being said, the caveat, LGBTQ romance in YA is a really good space at the moment. So
yeah, for sure. And also, just I think we see a lot of publishers looking for specific cultural perspectives. So even if you're in an oversaturated genre, but you bring some kind of unique cultural perspective to it, then they're much more looking for stuff along those lines. So if you're writing a middle grade fantasy about a witch, or like a kid that wants to be a witch, and it's sort of generic, they may not be as into that as if maybe, I don't know, you come from an indigenous culture, or like indigenous U.S. culture, where you can make the witch tradition more specific to that tribe, or you can use the folklore of, I don't know, you're from a small town in Mexico, and you can like use your own background and the stories your mother told you as a child about the local witch, or something like that. If you can bring that, they really respond well to
exactly it. Yeah, exactly. And that's on that topic. There is one thing that's a big no-no for publishers. Do not write a story about a lived experience that is not your own. So, and that even includes siblings and things like that. So, as an example, you can have a character that's disabled, it's in a wheelchair in your story if you're not disabled. But it shouldn't be the point of view character. You shouldn't be writing about disability if you're not in a wheelchair. Even if your cousin, brother, mother was in a wheelchair, unless you're writing about a child who is caring for a mother in a wheelchair, because that was your own lived experience. So it's not that you can't write characters, from different cultures. I'm white female. I am disabled, so I have a lot of disabled characters. I write characters of different ethnic groups to myself, and that's okay. But I would never write a story about a black slave girl in America fighting and trying to survive, because that's not my experience. I'm white. I have white privilege. That's not my story to tell. And publishers are even bigger on that now than they have been. They're really big on that. So that's something to be very, very aware of, because especially with children's literature, the publisher wants to sell you as much as your book, and children that want to see themselves in books want to also see themselves in the author. They know that they can achieve it too. So that doesn't mean that if you're straight, white, middle class, able-bodied, that you can't write. You've always still got a place. Everyone's got a place. Just choose. As an example, I was going to write a story about. I love the Aztecs, and I was going to write a story about Aztec treasure and treasure hunters trying to get. I live in the UK. That's not my story to tell. So I dropped it and I decided to focus on British myths and legends instead.
This is interesting because I think a lot of people draw the line here a little bit differently too. So some would say like you shouldn't write something that, like for instance, was set in that Aztec culture, and some would say maybe I've also seen it explained in such terms as like you can write a protagonist of whatever ethnic group or background or culture you want, but try not to make it actually trying to make a fundamental statement about what it means to be that culture or race or anything like that.
Yeah, one of my point of view characters is a black girl, but it's set in the future on a starship, where the issue is classes in different ships that you're born in, and I don't cover race because that's not my lived experience. And if a publisher wants me to change her race, I will, because it's not a hill I'm going to die on. But I agree with you. It's about, are you writing a story that has a character from a certain group? Can I write about a man? I'm a woman. Yes, Carmen. But if you're writing about the difficulties of a man, of a teenage boy who's having wet dreams, probably not, because that's a different type of story. That's a lived experience. Did you see what I mean? Though it's about, are you writing a character who is from a group, or are you writing about how difficult it is to be that character, and it's a story about what it is to be that character? That's the difference.
Right. So not like fundamentally about what it means to be a man at its deepest level necessarily. I would say you can write a male protagonist, or even about a soldier going to war or something like that. You can definitely do. But
so
try
Willow,
not to
you
speak
can
with an authority that you don't actually have. Go ahead.
Exactly. So Willow, you can have a disabled character, absolutely, to have a disabled character, and do your research and get sensitivity readers and all of that. As an example, there was an author who wrote an American book, YA book, and the type 1 diabetes community, I'm type 1, got really excited to see a type 1 diabetes character. Got this book, they read it, and as type 1 people, we immediately knew everything in there was wrong. She was talking about her nurse being concerned that her sugars were a certain level, and I can't really, because Americans have different levels to us, but it was basically like, we laughed at it because we're like, we wouldn't even give ourselves insulin at that level. That level is normal for type 1 diabetic. So, and also that book was a lot about the girl who was struggling with type 1 diabetes. And unless you have type 1 diabetes and have struggled, it's very hard to write that correctly. It's, but actually, if you want to include a type 1 diabetic character, and as long as you get the facts right, that you give insulin when they're low, you give insulin when they're high, not when they're low. Like every film has it when they have a low, and they're clearly having a hypo, and they give them insulin, and it's like, no, you're going to kill them. As long as you actually get your facts right. I love that representation. Don't write about the struggles, because that's harder to get. Is your book about the diabetic, or is it just they're diabetic going on an adventure? Right. They lose their insulin and they have a panic because they've lost their insulin, and it's part of the story, but it's not the story.
Exactly. And when you query some agents or publishers, they will have a field that you have to fill out that says, why am I the person to tell this story? And you can have an answer. You can answer that however you want. And the answer might be, because I really did my research, because I really dove into every aspect of this culture. I'm not trying to be a definitive voice on the culture, but I thought it would be amazing to write this story set in, I don't know, Morocco as an American, because I thought it would be a really rich, incredible setting for an adventure. Like, I did my research and met with these readers, and you have to sort of prove that you did the homework a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And just to clarify, that Aztec story that I dropped was me basically appropriating their culture. It wasn't English people who were going out there to find the stuff. Mm-hmm. It was me, so that's why I dropped it.
Understood.
You can still do the Mummy, where it's British people going to Egypt and whatever. That's fine.
It does have its own sort of problematic tropes and history associated with it.
Yeah.
So, read up on the history, do your research, do the homework, probably do an interview with somebody if you are going to write something in a fundamentally very different culture or setting. Go ahead.
And respect the agent. If the agent does actually specifically say, because I have seen some agents that specifically say they will not accept stories that are written from a point of view that is not your lived experience. Mm-hmm. And that's their choice to say that. They don't want to represent you. That's their choice. Same with publishers. Don't send it to them if you're writing a character that's not your lived experience. They're not the right people for you.
Right. Also, you have a little more leeway with this in adult than you do in children's.
Yes, definitely.
So let's go into what topics have we not seen explored as much, or that you'd like to see more kids' books or children's books. Kids' books is not really a term, so more children's fiction investigate or explore. For me, the one I think I'd like to see more of is historicals. I think there's a weird kind of, at least in America. I mean, in UK maybe is it different vibe around historicals in the UK?
I love historicals huge in the UK, but it's very interesting because my friend wrote a really successful she writes historical mysteries, and it's hugely successful in the UK. It's a bestseller. It's called Scarlet and Ivy, and out to America. She's got 6 books in the series in the UK. In America, after the 3rd book, they stopped translating it to American and doing the American covers because it just didn't sell.
Mm-hmm. We're weird with history. There's, I guess, the idea that history is boring to kids, or that it's hard for them to get invested in a setting that is drastically different from their own, even if it's I guess outside of American history. You could probably write a story about Benjamin Franklin's nephew having cool adventures with him or something like that, and that might be able to do well in a U.S. market. But there's a hesitance around historical periods or different historical cultural settings in the U.S. children's market, I've noticed.
I have also heard publishers say, so one of the big things they like is if you can sell it worldwide.
Right.
And do all the translation rights and everything. And it's more important for the UK because we're smaller, but it's the same for the US market as well. And one difficulty that publishers have is that something set in British Victorian time might not have appeal to Germans or Americans or Australians. So, and equally, something set in like you say, Ben Franklin's time might not have appeal to us, but there are some key time periods that I think does inspire everybody, and they're things like Roman. For us, it would be the American Civil War or the War of Independence. There are some kind of like the events that do seem to go across countries.
Mhm.
But I think that is one danger with history.
World War II being kind of just everyone. Yeah, there will be
Oh
World War
yeah,
II stories for the rest of human
World
culture.
War II books. Yeah, you want to write World War II, especially in children's literature. I personally don't like them, but yeah, if you can do them well, they will always sell.
Exactly.
So I know that publishers, like I said, they're looking for younger, funny books and older, funny books. They're looking for, it can be an adventure, but they really want that humor in there.
Mm-hmm.
For younger children, it tends to be that kind of potty humor. Kids love that. They're looking for, so they're looking for books, and I'd like to see the boarding school story come back because I do love it. It is coming back. That's my personal, like, I'd love to see.
You know what we see
And
a lot of now too, or what a lot of people seem to want, is YA thrillers.
yes, yeah. Oh, and it sounds really weird, and I thought it was only a UK thing. I spoke to a couple of friends who are children's writers in the US, and it does seem to be translating over to the US, and that is middle grade murder mysteries.
Right, that is so bizarre to me, but I take your word
But
for it that that's a real thing. There's a real demand for that.
key in it is, whereas an adult murder mystery would focus a lot on the victim and the victim's family and get to know them, with a children's murder mystery, the victim is just someone who's named a victim. You're interested in who did it, why they did it, and catching them.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my one, he's just called Shane Russell. That's his name. Nothing else about him other than the fact that he was working in the factories when he was murdered, and that's it. Like, yeah, as Willow said, it's basically a cozy mystery. So if you're doing a murder mystery for a child, it's got to be like equivalent of a cozy murder mystery for an adult. You don't do graphic stuff. The kids don't really see anything graphic. The murder's already happened at the start of the story. We
Right.
don't know the person who's been murdered. We have no emotional connection to the person who's been murdered.
Would we have
You
the
might
chance
have
that the killer will strike again, or would that not usually be part of it?
yeah. You have the chance they can strike again, and you can even have threat of death to the child. If I keep investigating this,
Mm-hmm.
the person who did this is now going to come after me. Like that.
Yeah.
That's a common midpoint, and you can have threat to family in the sense of I'm invested in this because my father, my brother, my uncle was accused of this crime.
Mm-hmm.
That's really common. Again, it can happen at the beginning or the midpoint. But
Or
now
my
I've got to find it because otherwise they're going to go to prison for it.
Right. I was going to say you can also do the my parent is a crime solver and I'm like their assistant trying to prove myself to them sort of storyline. Like Enola
Exactly.
Holmes. Those books are
Yes.
I don't think she's Sherlock Holmes' daughter, but she's his niece or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you're doing younger books and you want to still capture that murder mystery vibes, but you actually want to go, I want to go lower middle grade, or I want to do firmly middle grade, like not this maybe teen bit, but firmly middle grade. Do mysteries that are still like, they could go to prison for several years, but aren't murder. They can be jewel heists. They can be, someone's been accused of kidnapping. There's a really good book out there that was about, I wish I could remember the name, but it's literally, it's about to be the wedding, and the groom is kidnapped. And this kid is like, I've got to try and find where the groom is and why he was kidnapped and solve this because my family's falling apart and I'm the only one that's like sensible enough to do it.
Yeah, missing person type subgenre.
Yeah.
It works quite well.
Yeah, exactly. So
because you have all the urgency of the murder mystery, but without the upsetting graphic nature of the person being dead. Yeah.
And you can still have, I've got to work out who really stole these jewels because my dad's been put in prison and he didn't do it. It's still the same threat. Nancy Drew, yeah.
So there's a bunch for you just about subject matter of these types of books and stuff that is popular now, stuff that could be popular in the future. I will say high concept YA thrillers were like the rage a couple years ago. They still are big and they're still making big deals on like Amazon shows and stuff like that. So if you have a high concept YA thriller, especially one that involves themes of social media, influencers, true crime, podcasting, or like that kind of world of like online stuff, or tech or VR or video games or like esports or things like that. Things that or like Twitch streamers or things along those lines, things that kids really watch, and you have a if you have a high concept YA thriller about a streamer, you will sell that book.
And equally, like in the film industry, publishers are buying high concepts. So, Connor, you always say do the pitch, the one-line pitch. It's what publishers are looking for. That woman who did Scandal on the Unicorn Thief, literally, there was a publishing house bidding war, to get her book, purely on the fact they knew they could sell it to a film studio, because the concept is, what if unicorns aren't the stuff of nice dreams but the stuff of nightmares, and they're basically really exactly.
I'm
instantly
in, yeah.
you're like, oh yeah, you don't know anything about the characters, the story, but that's the concept, and it's the concept that sold. Got her £1 million deal.
I want to know about evil unicorns. I've never seen that before, so yeah.
I know, exactly.
My curiosity is definitely drawn by that.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Willow mentions in the chat also, technology can date the story, which is very true, and it's why these trends go quickly. It's like, that's why I mentioned, like, if you have a YA thriller about a streamer, that will sell now, but in 10 years will it sell? I don't know. So,
yeah. That is one of the reasons why very futuristic sci-fi or fantasy tend to be more long-lived classics. Like Harry Potter has no technology in it, because when she wrote it, technology wasn't a thing like it is now, but it's magic. So yeah, it's kind of about this becomes a hard thing. Do you want to write a book that, are you quick enough to write the books that get the trend now once you're in with the publisher, or are you slower? Because if you're slower, then focus more on universal themes,
right?
Exactly. Rather than
And you could even look back and look at something like Charlotte's Web, for instance. It's set on a farm, but that could be set in the 1800s, or that could be set right now, and it would make no difference at all.
Yeah, and do things like, I mentioned phones in my book, but I haven't specified my phone. I haven't specified what type of phone, so that in 20 years' time, when phones are holographic screens, still read it. They're still going to be called phones. They've always been called phones. They're always going to be called phones. Right. So, yeah.
Until they are just a chip in your brain, and then
that's true. Yeah.
So let's look at prose. I think we should move ahead to this part where we're going to look at the specific craft of words on the page when it comes to children's fiction. What differentiates prose and syntax when you're writing for young readers versus writing for adults? Because you write for both, Becky.
I do. I would say with there's a difference between middle grade and YA as well. You've got to be thinking about their vocabulary levels, so you've got to really think about what age you're writing for. What you're writing will be very different if you're writing a picture book or a chapter book versus if you're writing YA. Thinking about the words that they know, but also don't be afraid to give them new words. So there's a common thing in children's literature where people think they need to dumb down their prose, and I don't want to use that word because children won't know it. If it's clear in the context of you're teaching a child a new word, which is part of reading to learn. Don't do it too often because they won't be able to read it. But this is the interesting thing, because I write very simple prose. I write dyslexic friendly. So I keep my sentences short. I write a lot of similes rather than metaphors. So I will say it is like, but it's as big as a, rather than saying it is, because that is clearer to the reader who doesn't yet understand metaphor, to understand, oh, you're saying that it's as warm as an oven in here, not that they've literally walked into an oven.
Right.
But J.K. Rowling, for example, if you put her text into what age is this suitable for, her books, even her first book, is actually suitable for a child with a reading ability of 12 years old. which is really old for the age that it was aiming at. I mean, the main character's 11, so but children read it and have become better at reading because of it. So it's I wouldn't say it's much different from adults in the sense of what you're writing. One thing I would say is don't do flowery prose. I mean, you shouldn't read that for adults anyway, but children, it's really important. Write clearly. Don't spend pages and pages on description. They need a clear image, but they don't want that. Be clear about what you're writing.
Sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Be clear about what you're writing.
Be clear about it. Yes, exactly. And what I was going to touch on in relation to that is something you will see in older books that are aimed for older books and books that are aimed for adults that I think really trips up that clarity, especially in children's, is like, and I'm thinking of like certain passages from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books, for instance, where it'll say something like, you know, sweeping across the plain like a vast field of or like a vast swarm of glittering automatons, the knights charged over the hill. It's like, well, we just put the thing that happened after the description of the thing. So,
yeah, exactly.
And so the longer that you wait until you say the subject and what they're doing, then you will it can lead to this confusion, and the kid is like waiting to be able to form a picture in their head. Whereas it's a little easier if you start with like the knights rode over the hill, and then you go into the description.
And then you say she saw the school. It was like a vast palace. Oh, great! We've got an image of a palace. Now you can describe the red brick and the intricacies. Or Harry saw the castle. Now you can describe. It's a castle. Now you can describe all the glittery and magic, and because now we know it's a castle.
Yeah, it's about building concrete images, I think. As opposed to starting your description, or you could start the same paragraph, the description of the old house, by saying something like, you know, wreathed in ivy, abraded crumbling bricks along the side of a house. It's like, oh, okay, you should have just started with the thing first. Rather than describing it and then say it. But that's not to say that's not good prose. Like, obviously Tolkien has amazing prose, but just that when children or younger readers or readers that are less experienced, their brain is trying to form an image as they read a line. And in order, especially if they have problems visualizing, and I used to work at a learning center where we specialized in readers that struggled with visualizing and verbalizing and things like this, being able to create pictures for things they see in their heads. Not everyone's able to do that perfectly. And to get, especially if you're still working on that, it's easier to have subject up top. So subject is one of the first things in the sentence, if not the first word of the sentence. And then from there be able to, so once we can see the knight, then we can tell what he's doing, rather than putting it together in reverse.
And there's things on that, like as I said about, you know, the metaphor, not using metaphors don't use metaphors for lower middle grade and under. They haven't even known what they are yet.
Right, exactly.
But then there's other things as well, like kind of want to exaggerate. So when I'm thinking about describing my characters, and again, not so much for YA, but definitely for middle grade, exaggerate their features. So you know, I talk about the sharp nose, and you know, and actually you do want to describe what they look like, what characters look like. Yeah, really kind of have that but there you go, you're going to bring it up. Yes.
Just a nice description from Sorcerer's Stone of the Hagrid character that uses really evocative word choices. I won't necessarily read it out loud, but you can just browse this on your own if you want to check this out.
I'll do the little bit here where it says loud and so wild, long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of trash can lids, and his feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphins. These are things that kids know. Kids know what trash can lids look like. They know the size of a baby dolphin, so they can match it. But it's silly enough. It's a silly enough comparison that it stands out in your brain. And actually, J.K. Rowling is the absolute best at defining characters. And the way she does it is using the same thing to describe the characters so it gets stuck in your head. So Dumbledore has a crooked nose. Mm-hmm. And every now and then, she doesn't do it constantly, but she will just sprinkle it in again, his crooked nose,
Right.
just to remind you. And it's always that crooked nose and those piercing blue eyes, and so when you have your character, you need to know what they look like. Whether you do that by casting an actor, if you can't visualize it, creating the image in AI art, whatever you want to do, you need to know what they look like. And then every now and then you just remind the reader of that key thing.
Yeah. I thought that this description of this Hunger Games character as well uses that same sort of premise of comparing this character to a bird, and then sort of using that physicality to kind of embody them, and like that central metaphorical comparison of this girl is like a bird is just able to easily evoke that image of that person.
And notice that even this being YA, as if ready to take wing at the slightest sound, still got that simile. It's still saying, this is like this, rather than actually saying
she was a bird that was ready to take
wing. Like, if this is an adult, you might not put as if. You might just get extended to her size, ready to take wing at the slightest sound. You wouldn't need to say as if. For the kids, you need to put that in.
Right, exactly. So shall we?
Go
ahead.
Unless it's a really well-known metaphor, but then you verge on cliche.
So these are all just good guidelines. I would say the best way to get a handle on children's book prose is to read children's books. I guess that seems obvious when you say it like this, but you gotta read the kind of thing that you want to write, and you should read modern stuff too.
Yeah, you need to read stuff published within the last 10 years, 5 years preferably. Classics is not how it's written now. Classics was written in the era of adults were making children read, basically.
Right. So, shall we try a little activity, a little game? What if we took the opening paragraph of Pride and Prejudice and we rewrote this for, let's imagine, a middle grade story?
Yeah.
It's going to be tough. It doesn't have to be perfect. But why don't we just I'll read it out loud, and then you can sort of study it for a moment and just tell me what changes would you make, what words are too advanced, how would we explain these same concepts in a more concrete, evocative, to-the-point way that would work better for young readers.
Yeah.
So let's read it out loud. One of the most famous opening paragraphs in all of literature, by the way.
Yes.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. Kind of a complicated-ish idea, but if we boil it down, maybe it's not that complicated.
So the very first thing I'd note is that second sentence, that is literally 1, 2, 3, 4 and a bit lines.
Mm-hmm.
That's way too long for a children's book sentence, even a YA sentence. That'd be the first thing I'd know. And it's got several clauses. However little known the feelings of his views, such a man be on his first entering a neighborhood, his truth is so fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the right. That's got like 2 complex things in. Now, obviously, this is also an older book, so it's using a lot of older language.
Yeah. Maybe let's break down what specifically it's saying. So, single men who have money want wives. That's the first point.
Mm-hmm.
The second point is, however little known the feelings or views of such a man may be. So it doesn't matter what the feelings or views of such a man. Doesn't matter exactly where he comes from. The fact that he is rich and wants a wife is enough that this is complicated, isn't it? He's considered the rightful property of different families' daughters. So lots of girls will want to marry him too.
Yeah. So I would probably do it. I don't know the feelings or the view of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood. Truth so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families. It's usually the pressure is put on the women's on the women by their family to marry rich, I would say.
Okay, so lots of girls
minds of the surrounding families
will want their daughter to marry him.
Yeah.
Lots of families want their daughter. Okay, so I think just to break it down in terms of the most basic points, that's what we're saying here.
Yeah.
So how would we
Now,
rewrite the paragraph, do you think?
I really like the concept of the "it's a truth universally acknowledged," but universally acknowledged is kind of a mouthful. So I would probably say something like, especially if you're doing it from a kid's point of view, whether it's third person or whether it's first person, it's always close, so it's in their head.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone knows that a rich man wants a wife.
Everyone knows that rich guys want wives.
Or guys want wives, yeah.
This is kind of fun.
Exactly.
I kind of like this. All right. Everyone knows rich guys want wives. And then what about one more sentence?
A little known. I have a little known about his feelings or views. No one cares what he thinks or believes. Just the fact that he's rich means that families will want their daughters to marry him.
Yeah, maybe like families get one, or parents get one look at him and, shove their daughters in his direction.
Yeah.
That might even be a little bit too literary or something
shove,
like that. But
yeah, no, I like to shove their daughters in this direction, yeah.
Everyone knows that.
And this is, you can actually see this being, like, because obviously it's the character's point of view, but you can actually see this being a 15-year-old who's like, they shove them in a direction, like, I don't want to be with this guy, but this is what happens in our society. You can actually hear them thinking this.
Right. So we put it more if this were a modern YA book, because I think Lizzie is a teenager as this book begins.
Yeah.
Then if this were written as a modern day YA book, we'd put it a little more in this internal voice of, I guess in the modern context, like, we aren't really filtering as much, or like, I guess, even like, you can even look back at something like The Diary of Anne Frank, for instance, where she was intending for this to be read by other people eventually, and so she's not exactly writing it like a traditional journal. Like, we're not like in the head of that character at that moment. She's curating this, and I think that older books would have more of that sort of level of curation and careful choice of words and like specific voice to the narrator, rather than it just being the kid in the moment talking to the audience.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the other thing, is it doesn't matter if it's first person or third person. It's always one point of view. You don't head hop. I mean, head hopping isn't going to do it, but what am I saying? For example, I do multiple point of views, but they change at the end of the chapters. Young people say themselves, true. I change it at the beginning of chapters, and I put the character's name at the beginning just to make it really clear. But you can't, in the middle of a chapter, with Lord of the Rings, you might put a break in, and then go to a different character's point of view. And a modern, an adult reader who's experienced in reading hard fantasy, we got a space here, and now we're in Aragon's point of view. I get that. A child would be completely lost by that.
Yeah, and that is something that if you look at even middle grade and YA books from the 80s and 90s, which I guess is a little bit before we called them that specifically, they would have head hopping a lot more. Diana Wynne Jones books have a ton of head hopping, which you just would not see published in the same way nowadays, or there would be a strong distaste for it in terms of publishing now.
Yeah.
This was fun. I actually really liked this game. I thought this would be really hard to do, but I enjoyed boiling it down like that.
I thought it was going to be really hard. When I saw it, I was like, oh, but yeah.
It kind of works. Shall we look at, we have one more game to get into, but we also have a little bit on publishing. So
I wanted to do, if you go on to the next slide, there we go. I wanted to talk about word counts. Mm-hmm. This is something that's really important, and also causes a lot of arguments in my group that I'm part of in Golden Egg, because word counts have really dropped, especially since COVID. The expectation is really low, and it really annoys people, and it annoys me as well, because I always write longer books, but they are getting really strict. So picture books can be up to 1,000 words, absolute max. you're looking at about 100 to 250 words. And if you're talking about board books, you know, aimed literally at babies, you're looking at only about 10. Up to 1,000 max is if you're aiming at that slightly older picture book. But yeah, it's really, really low. Chapter books are for the early reader, it's up to 2,500 words, and then the next stage is 3,000 to 15,000. So you don't have a lot of words to tell a story, and you've got all this complex. And even in a picture group, you've got a picture book, you've got some kind of character growth. It might be really basic, simple, but it's there. You've got to still establish the character. You still got to have a start. You still got to have the inciting incident. You still got to have a complex in the middle. So in the one we read, got eaten halfway through. You know, and you still got to have an end. You still got to have a twist. You still got to have an ending. You haven't got a lot of words to do it, and none of these you got a lot of words. So middle grade and YA are the main two, and I've also put teen in there because there's leeway with that. But middle grade it used to be a lot higher. The first Harry Potter book is, some sources say it was 79k, other sources say it was 85k, so it's around that mark. Nowadays, you're lucky if you can write a book that is 60k, and it's very exceptional. I'll tell you the exception, and even with mine, I've been told I might have to cut it down. But 10k to 40k for contemporary, and you get an extra 10k if you're doing sci-fi fantasy for the world building. An exception could be mine is a dual point of view, so I've got a little bit more character stuff to do. So mine is currently 67k, and my editor wants me to bring it down to about 60. I've still got to lose 7k words somehow. So yeah, it's tight, and that is a whole story. That is, the story for middle grade needs to be as complex with structure and your character as any adult novel, right? So you got to be really tight. So we were talking about prose earlier. There isn't the space for that kind of nice purple flowery prose that you sometimes can get away with in longer adult books. There isn't the space for the lengthy descriptions of beautiful castle. We can't do Harry Potter anymore. So yeah, it really is hard. YA is 40k to 70k, which again feels really short for almost an adult book, and up to 80k for sci-fi and fantasy. You'll find exceptions. That one I told you about, Scandal and the Unicorn Thief, is 90k. That wasn't what she sent it to the publisher as. She sent it to the publisher as about, I don't know, I can't remember what it was. It was a lot shorter. It was about where we're looking at. It was a middle grade book. And it was the publisher that said, I want you to do a lot more world building with this. And the publisher got her to make it longer. But publishers are thinking about every 1,000 words costs to translate. Children have lower attention spans than they did 10 years ago. Children can be looking at Twitch, looking at YouTube, and all the others. So they need punchy stories. And on that topic, another big difference is, in a middle grade book, your inciting incident needs to happen within the first 3 chapters, preferably the first chapter. At the end of the first chapter, if you can get the inciting incident happening, boom. Kids don't care about knowing about the character until you know what the story's about. Once they know what the story's about, then you can learn about the character. Whereas adult books, you might spend a bit like, let's get to know this detective. Oh, now the crime happens. I mean, not all of them do that. You know, some do.
The ending, the cliffhanger at the ending of your first chapter makes a great spot for an inciting incident. So it's just like
exactly
really short first chapter that ends with the thing that kicks the story into motion.
That's how I won the Golden Egg Award. I had 1,000 words. That was all I had, 1,000 words to convince them. And they wanted 250 words for where I thought the story was going. I had to write this first chapter in just 1,000 words and sell them on the concept. So that first chapter was just girly in a courtroom trying to get sent to this off-world prison on Mars, on Titan, Saturn's moon Titan, and we're wondering, why does she want to be sent there? And it ends with, she's really happy she got to be there, something like, now she'd finally find out what happened to her missing parents. You got your answer, but now you got 1,000 more questions. So that's what sold it, was literally the inciting incident of her getting sent from within the first 1,000 words.
Yeah.
Now I've since with my editor expanded that to 2,000, but there's that. So the word counts are strict. There are exceptions, but why make your life harder? They will throw your manuscript out. If you submit something you say is a middle grade and it's 80,000 words, they're not even going to read it.
Right. So speaking of tips for success, what suggestions do you have for those watching who want to break into writing children's?
So the obvious one is to make sure that you've got a book which is really polished before you send it off, and also that you're clear about the age group you're writing for. There are very clear distinctions, and I'm sure we can do another one maybe, Conor, at one time, where we can go through, for people who are really interested, on the nitty-gritty differences between age groups, because there are some even between lower middle grade and upper middle grade, but know exactly who, and the more specific you are, the better. Like I say, I'm writing for a 12-year-old with this one, and find agents that are looking for books in that age group. Don't think, they're saying they're looking for YA, but mine's upper middle grade, I might be able to get away with it. No, they said YA, and the agents will be that specific in children's literature. You can look them up, they will say specifically what age group they're looking for. Usually you then send your letter with your pitch and outline and your first 3 chapters. That's usually what they ask for. But look at the instructions. Some want the whole manuscript. If you're writing picture books, they usually want your first 3 picture books. So you're expected to do more than one.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow. Multiple books.
Yeah. Yes. If it's a picture book, yeah, absolutely. But keep the letter short. So they want literally a 1-line pitch, what your story is about, and they want, where does it fit on the shelf, what other books are like it, what are your comps. Then they want, you can do a little bit longer, then you can do a little bit more of a blurb, but not a whole book length blurb. And then they want a little bit about you, what awards you've won, why you're the right person to tell this story, anything like that. And then they usually will read the first 3 chapters before they read your outline. But your outline, again, needs to be succinct. It's usually 1 page. They only want the key story, and more succinct you are, the better, which I struggle with.
Right. A lot of authors
agents, yeah. Agents want to know what else you have. So if you get that phone call, you don't need to put it in the letter. If you get that phone call, we want to talk, be prepared to say, well, I've been working on this as well, or I have this idea as well, because they want to buy you as an author. It's the same with publishers as well, but usually they want to buy the same kind of books. If you don't want to write YA, but you want to write middle grade, make sure your first book is middle grade, because you're kind of going to get stuck in what you write for. Some authors can break out, but just be prepared for that.
Yeah, you have to have an agent that would be open to you doing... Like, if you have an agent that specifically reps multiple categories, you're probably in better shape there than if they're like, I only do one specific thing.
But even then, with publishers, they're building you up as a middle grade author.
Yeah.
And if you then go to YA... It's actually easier to go from middle grade to YA because the kids grow up and then we'll go, I love this author. But doing it the other way is going to be impossible because, well, not impossible, but really hard.
You can start with a new name. They do that sometimes, don't they?
Yes, they do that all the time. That's what they do. So you can go into others, and if you go in saying I want to write across age ranges, you can. A lot of people have managed it, but just be prepared that some publishers will categorize you and it'll be really hard. My friend that I told you about is in historical fiction now. That's what she writes because they built her as a historical fiction writer. So
exactly. And yeah, I just read, for instance, I read Gallant by V.E. Schwab, which is the YA and middle grade publishing name of Victoria Schwab when she writes for adults. So you can do that sometimes where like you do have to build them as sort of separate careers a little bit, but there's enough crossover that if like the kid grows up, eventually wants to check out your adult books, that will still feed to your
They can do it.
business.
But that's a question you'd have for your agent and then your publisher. They offer you representation, but it's up to you to accept it. So if you're someone who wants to write across all ages, something you mention, and if they're not interested in that, then maybe they're not the right agent or publisher for you, and you move on. It's about that kind of. Some publishers are one way and some publishers another.
Right.
Also, sorry, go back on that other one. Publishers are looking, when it comes to middle grade and YA and chapter books, standalone with series potential. So no cliffhangers at the end of your books. You can do that later on in the series if it does really well, or if you're already a really successful author, you can do it. But none of that. You can kind of have a hint to another adventure, like, oh, we solved this murder. Oh, did you hear about this one? And it ends there, because that implies these kids are going to carry on. But that standalone with series potential, they say they want standalone because they don't want you to spend your time writing an entire series and then the first book flops and the publisher doesn't publish the rest.
Yeah.
But kids go back to the same characters. So actually, the publishers do want it to be a series. They hope your book will be a series. They just don't want to promise you it will be.
Yeah, that's why standalone with series potential is sort of the standard thing you should pretty much always say when you're querying, unless you know for sure it's a standalone, but even then maybe kind of say it's with series potential, because that is just attractive to them.
And even if you've written it as standalone, try and have an idea in your head of, if they say, can you make it into a series? Even if that series is, it's going to be an anthology of now a different character, but in the same universe or whatever, try and have an idea of how you could do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot of freedom to do that in books that you don't have in writing for the screen. Like sequels that can just evolve the premise a little bit, or change the main character, or maybe we're following the friend now instead of the lead that we had in the last book. Or you have more ability to do that, so you can lean into that too.
Yep.
Shall we hit your last publishing facts slide?
Right, so this one, firstly, it's slower than adult publishing. Adult publishing is slow. Children's publishing is even slower, and it has been since COVID. Everything shut down in children's publishing during COVID, because whereas young adult was kind of okay, whereas young adult and adults could buy on Kindle, children's books are sold either by libraries and school libraries, or by going into the bookshop. There are still bookshops, and they have whole sections of kids' books. Go into one and just listen to kids looking at the books. I always like to do that, just to kind of see what they're into. But you will see, and children don't buy Kindle books. They do not read books on Kindle. They get books, they do look at the cover, and that's how they buy. So the problem was that books boomed, Amazon boomed, but it was all books that had already been published, that friends were recommending to other friends. So publishers stopped the debut author books coming out, because they didn't have a chance to sell, because all the bookshops were closed and all the schools were closed. That means we now have a backlog, and we still have a backlog of people that were meant to be published in 2020 and 2021 that are only now starting to get published. Also, what happened was everyone then started trying to write, and a common misconception is it's easier to write children's books, which meant that a lot of people were trying to do that. So all agents are getting more queries than they ever have. It's a particularly big thing in the children's market, where you had agents who were getting maybe 50 queries a week. Now they're getting 500. And I've actually heard this from agents. They've told us this. So it's really slow. Even when you've finally got an agent and they finally sold it to a publisher and you sign that contract, you're still looking at 2 years before it comes out. Just be prepared for that. Publishers have a house style. So with children's books, they often have a set number of pages. They might have a specific way of writing, or they might have a specific thing they don't cover. another publisher might. So it's worth, when you're reading your children's books, also looking at the publisher. And if you find one that you really like, look at the publisher, because if it's your kind of style, it might suit you. It's important in all in every bit of writing, but it's really important with kids lit. Royalties, less than 15% of people earn out their royalties. If you're looking to actually make a living and be able to quit your job, go into writing adult books, not kids lit. It's really hard. If you do earn it out, you get about 10-12% of the cover price, and it's usually paid out twice a year. It's really, really rare. So be prepared for the fact that my friend that I told you about that's published, like, she's about to publish her 9th book. She still has a part-time job. That's just the way it is. But on the plus side, 33% of all books sold in the US in 2022 were children's books, including YA, and 23% of all books globally are children's books. That does go picture books right up to YA. It's a growing market. We went from tiny little, I've seen the shops grow from this tiny little section to this kind of bigger section to now having a whole back wall being it's lit and then a separate section being YA because it's just so big. It is a massive growing market. So on the plus side, there's plenty of room for everyone.
Great. Thank you so much.
And also,
go ahead.
you do want to go for traditional publishing unless you're doing YA. As I said, children don't read Kindle. Yeah, YA has got a pretty successful self-publishing market for anything lower. Yeah.
Whereas, if the kids aren't buying the books themselves, then they're typically not searching stores for ebooks and audio. Though the parents may give them audio for younger readers to play in the car or like to play before bed or stuff like that.
And that's another thing to very quickly touch on. I know we're getting to the end, but you've got to remember with kids lit, not so much with YA, because at that age, they're old enough to go into the bookshop and buy it themselves or get recommendations from a friend. But certainly middle grade and lower, you've got to accept that there's an extra gatekeeper. So you've got the gatekeepers of the publishers like you normally have, but also you've got parents. And so earlier on, we sort of touched on things that are no-goes in kids lit. You can touch on topics. There isn't really anything that's a no-go because it all depends on how you do it. As we've seen, there was a picture book where a child got eaten. It all depends on how you do it. However, there are certain things that parents will not like. Do not put swear words into your middle grade book. You can make up a word that is a swear word. That's acceptable. But do not put an actual swear word in a middle grade book. Because don't put them in here.
You could say something like, and then he unleashed a string of the ugliest curse words you've ever heard. I've seen that sometimes.
Absolutely.
Where it'll, describe
absolutely.
someone
I've seen
swearing.
That. I do that. I have kids swear. I just don't actually write the swear word.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It's those kind of things to be aware of. That you do have gatekeepers who are parents. And I just want to end with a quote from R.L. Steins, who writes horror children, because you might not think, and I'm going to paraphrase here, horror is a huge growing market in middle grade. Children thirst for horror. And what he says is anything goes except stuff that children could actually face in real life. So he never writes about serial killers who are hunting children. He never writes about parents who are abusive to their children. He never writes about parents being drunk, and therefore abusive to their children. Because those are things that he says children read for escapism. And I think that's the key there, is that sometimes you're writing for a child who is lying in bed, they're hiding away from a horrible home life, and they're reading to escape. Give them a wonderful story.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Becky. I think that's a good note to end on. I had one more activity we can do at a later time. But this has been so fun. Maybe we have a few people here. If anyone has a question, we can take a question or two, but we're basically at the end of our time. Yeah. Anything that you guys are wondering or that we didn't cover in the class that you wanted to ask about before we wrap up? And you can feel free to either raise a hand or just type in the text.
And typing. I will say that if anyone's thinking of writing for children and do want to go far more in depth about, maybe they're struggling, maybe you're struggling with what age you're writing for or whether it's suitable, I am always happy to do another section where we can go through your stuff. Children's fiction is kind of the area that I'm confident in, so and also you feel free to contact me if you want to go over your stuff and check about the suitability or the age range or anything like that.
Yeah, let's tell people about do you still run Novel Circle, Becky?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So usually at the time that we've done this, but obviously we did this instead. Mm-hmm. So at I suppose it'd be 12 p.m. your time. It's 8 p.m. my time.
Yeah, noon on
Circle.
Sundays.
On Sundays, I do Novel Circle, which is an hour long, and it's for anyone writing any kind of novel. If there is enough interest in YA downwards, I'm happy to run one specifically for Kids Lit as well, but only if there's enough interest. And by enough interest, even if it's just one or two of you to go really in depth, thank you, Nacho, I'm happy to do that as well. Yeah, so
thank you so much, Becky.
Novel Circle, kind of all ages.
Yeah, so come to Novel Circle. That's on this Discord server. That's on WordCamp. Sundays at noon Pacific time, or 8 p.m. London time, right?
Yeah, British Summer Time.
Okay, great. Yeah, British Summer Time. Didn't know that it was called that. Okay, cool.
Yeah, BST. Yeah.
BST. Got it. Thank you. Okay, that'll wrap us up for today. You've got all these upcoming boot camps over here that you guys could come by. We'd love to see you at Pilot Boot Camp starting September 15th, Fridays 6 to 8. Feature Boot Camp, that's Sundays 10 to noon. Or Novel Boot Camp, the new session starting September 30th, 12 to 2 here on WordCamp. Thank you guys so much. Go ahead. Any last words?
I will say with the novel outlining, everything that Conor teaches in that is equally relevant for writing for children. All of the rules, all of the structure, all of the hero's journey, all of that, it's all exactly the same for children's fiction.
Yep, it's just the word count that's going to be the big difference there. Thank you, Becky, and thank you guys all for coming by and listening to this class. We'd be glad to see you soon at your next Script Camp class, activity, or workshop. Have a great rest of your weekend.